Okay, today I want to share some ideas and information concerning the big topic of why won't they just wake up, directed mostly to aspects of truth movement, truth communities, all kinds of people really who see the state of the world, the direction things have gone in for some time now, and are wondering, what about everybody else? Um, so prerequisites sort of, if this were kind of a course or whatever, which it isn't, but there's going to be, I'm not going to spend time referring to what's all the information that concerns being awake, what that really constitutes. So that's kind of its own subject. And, there's tons of information about all of that. Or you can just be open-minded or just curious. So now let's kind of get started thinking very broadly, generally, and this is going to go in a variety of different directions, but I've really taken the time and trying to kind of craft a through line at the same time. So there's a bit of a line to follow here. So first consider this idea, of course, of the world, a planet, the Earth. What is a world? So, a planet way up there in the night sky, sometimes something that we see, something very much physical, even if it has energetic properties to it, right? But there's another definition of a world that we use in common parlance, right? The idea of a place feeling like a different world. I moved to a different city and it felt like a different world. So it's really more about the energy. It's more a collection of human energy. It's a cultural place. Cultural aspects often figure prominently into what we mean when we talk about what a world is, in this sense of kind of a human energy place. Or you could look at it as a self-contained unit of mass consciousness. So a world being a whole collection of energy and a collection of feeling that's organized somehow along civilizational lines. Also pertaining to the idea of consciousness, of course, so that human spark. And when multiple sparks get together, you get this notion, this concept of love. Communities, building communities in that sense. What does this mean, though? Normally we think of a certain contrast of the individual versus the collective as the whole. So in that sense, it's just sort of one or the many. But can there be multiple collectives? So can we actually talk about multiple energetic worlds all together operating here? I think the overlapping and the interacting of all these different shards of consciousness or light or sparks as we see gives the notion of a world as a discrete whole of human energy. So that's going back to this concept of, this city feels like that, this country feels like that, that's the beginnings of what I'm talking about here, that human energy that creates a feeling, as things have been described for a long time in, say, literature, a world. While this might not be terribly unfamiliar for some, there are many interesting and far-reaching implications here, as we're going to see. If we're talking about a world, we're talking about the entire breadth and the entire depth of collective human experience. We're really talking about an entire class of people's interface to the everything. So I really want to, encourage you to try to expand the notion of a world and think as broadly as possible here as we go on. Here, like a ribbon of light, different colors coming together with a time element too, as the notion of a flowing and ebbs and flows. And this one even from young ages, and the world, the spherical notion here as it coalesces with light and clouds and a rainbow. This last image here reflects the world as being a completely formed and unique entity, even to the small child. That's something to kind of think about. But don't children have to grow into the world? What energy world are you in when you're born? Maybe they are starting life in a different one. So then what about physical space? How does that fit into this whole notion then? If we're talking about what world are we in when we grow up? What worlds are we in when we're born? Energetically, of course. What about physicality? What role is that playing? How can we have multiple worlds in the energetic sense, in the consciousness sense we're talking about, but only one physical planet? Isn't our relation to physical reality something that's well defined? Now consider the role of the imagination as it plays into all of this and trying to figure out where energy meets physicality. Consider an author who's crafting a physical place through the art of storytelling. A time and a place setting, one example, you could think of New York in 1900, or Los Angeles today, or Rome or India, whatever. What if small details in the story are changed? And that's Mark Twain, of course, who probably wasn't writing about New York in 1900, but still, that's a cool picture. So anyway, going to this idea of New York in the early 1900s, for example, let's say this is taken from reality, and you sort of look at all the human energy, the human potential and consciousness contained in this image, and the idea that it's corresponding to a real place that actually existed in this way. Well, what if then in storytelling, in writing a book, part of this is changed, and all of a sudden the name of the restaurant is changed from Blossom to Peaches, for instance, a word kind of scrubbed, thinking about this visually, how this might be told, through a story, where you change one detail, just one small thing, in this whole sea of something that's allegedly actually was true. How far is the imaginative gap to separate the real from the fictitious? And that's sort of the question here. The fact is, this is something that we're all doing, whether we are writers or people who are imaginative and creative for a living or not. The idea of creativity and imagination flows into all of our lives as just part of what we do naturally. For example, stories are pouring out of us all the time. Just in recounting a story to somebody else, our own conception of the world becomes the world as we are telling it. For example, in kind of a case of two men just discussing something in a village, for example, adding up each individual perspective. What do you have? One stable landmass or shifting seas? The idea here being, if everyone is attempting to describe the world as they see it and as they remember it, you could have somebody like, individuals who have lived in the same town for, 70 years, for example, who remember the place to be, have a mental picture of where they live in their mind that is very clear. They know the streets, they know the alleyways, the buildings, the landscape, everything. And yet, no matter how good their mental picture is, if they were to actually sit down and draw the whole place, they would be making all kinds of mistakes, all kinds of errors. In the digital age, we kind of tend to forget that when you reduce, or not really reduce, but when you understand the world or part of the world on the consciousness level, we really are talking about, so much coming down to memory and then imagination filling in the gaps. Because as we describe a place, when we deviate from quote unquote reality, something's filling in that gap, and that's imagination. The idea of different paths, different figments of memory, all kind of trading places and zigzagging. So hold on, we were talking about multiple groups of humanity being put into largely or partially discrete groups, different worlds, that word of world, right? Imagination aside, don't we still have to live on the same planet here? How can we think of this? What's a way to think about all of that? And I think one way is the idea of different rings or Venn diagram type idea, but this kind of a picture. And what happens is the physical becomes the intersecting portion, and the energy spirals out to either side. Physicality is the link. Just as our bodies define us in this world, the world solidifies our relation to others, whether they are close to us energetically or not. What's an example for something that could separate people to such a degree? So now we're talking about, okay, so we have, this energetic picture of the physical, but is there anything, can we actually think of categories of things that people interpret so differently that you could have groups of humanity coalescing into different energetic layers or different worlds while still occupying the same planet? And I think a very good example of that is when we tie back to this idea of asleep versus awake, or what is at least commonly meant by that distinction, right? On the left, you have kind of to represent this idea of awake, someone who's looking for all these signposts, all pointing him in different directions to go to the same place. The idea of someone who's confused you know, in a world that's really a series of conflicting signposts on a kind of philosophical level. And on the right, you have kind of a stereotypical image of growth, rootedness, and expansion to represent being awake. Is the difference between asleep and awake really that great, however? You know, maybe this is kind of an exaggeration to really start using this term world to describe people who just are in different levels of understanding. But try thinking in terms of energy here. I think that's important. How much energy does it actually take to move between systems? You know, to move between, let's say, on the left to the right here in this kind of these interlocked rings. Well, from the world of nature, we have some ideas about this, definitely. Think about boiling water. The amount of energy it takes to put into that system to get the water hot enough to turn into a gas. Or think about a musician who's playing notes, you know, and as he gets higher and higher and higher in the range, that's more energy that's, you know, that the frequency is going up and up and up as you're pumping air at such a rate into that kind of air column of the musical instrument. So it's a lot more energy to go up in levels here. How difficult is it really to go from asleep to awake, though? This is a transition that can take years. It often proceeds in multiple stages, and some would say it never really ends, right? I mean, just all the material, the literature, the ideas, the videos, people talking about this whole concept, been around now for some decades in these terms of awakening, right? This is a big, big deal, supposed to be anyway. For those who feel they have undergone the change to, you know, justify being called awake, how much energy did it take you to make that flip, and how different is your worldview afterwards? Those are things to consider as you think about, you know, this idea of a system of energy where energy has to be put or pumped into the system in order to raise your level up a whole big notch. This idea of huge amounts of natural energy too. Perhaps it's not an exaggeration to say that the approximate energy states we're talking about here and the categories that different people find themselves in really do function like different worlds. We are united by participation in this same 3D style reality, if you want to call it that, but below that surface, sort of like icebergs, there's a big gap. Picturing icebergs sort of with most of their volume, most of their bodies underwater, and we see just the tips above the surface, right? That you have people meeting in the physical worlds, but actually coming from energetic bodies and worlds that most of which you can't see. However, this whole thing's not going to be some lofty praise of the idea of being awake or being awakened, because there's a lot more to this whole story, as we are going to see. So finally, to end this sort of introduction here, why would you want to wake up? Or another way to look at that question is, why subject yourself to pain and choose a reality with darkness? However, you know, consciousness is power. Some people may actually be aware of their decision to stay asleep. And for the rest, the human body is an incredible organism.